At the engagement dinner, the groom raised his glass with a smug grin and said, "To my future wife, and her worthless old father, who won't be around much longer." The whole room erupted in laughter, cheers, mockery. Everyone thought it was hilarious. The father slowly stood up, looked the groom dead in the eyes, and spoke just 5 words. The laughter died instantly. The groom's knees buckled, his glass shook in his hand. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is in your region right now. My name is Raymond Fletcher. I'm 64 years old, and I've lived in Portland, Oregon for most of my adult life. For 27 years, I worked as a licensed real estate appraiser, the kind of man people called when they needed to know the actual worth of something, not the asking price, not the emotional value, the real number, cold and defensible in court. That's what I did. I walked through houses, looked past the fresh paint and staged furniture, and told people what they actually had. Turns out that skill doesn't stay at the office. I do some part-time consulting now. Nothing demanding, just enough to keep my mind sharp. The rest of my time belongs to my garage workshop, my record collection, and my morning walks along the Willamette. Simple life, built carefully. The house at 2847 SE Hawthorne Boulevard is mine. 3 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, built in 1978. I know every creak in those floors. I paid off the mortgage 17 years ago. I have not once been late on a single bill connected to that house. It is not just a house. It is the thing I built, so my daughter would always have somewhere to land. Megan is 33. She got her sharpness from me and her warmth from somewhere I can't fully explain. She used to call me every Sunday morning, even after she moved into her own place across town. We'd talk for an hour about nothing. Coffee, a book she was reading, something absurd she'd seen on her walk. I loved that about her. I loved all of it. Then, roughly 3 years ago, she met Devin Chancellor. I didn't dislike him immediately. That would make me the cliché of the suspicious father, and I've never been that. Devin was 33, well-dressed in that deliberate way. Not expensive exactly, but studied. He called himself a financial consultant. He had a firm handshake and the kind of eye contact that signals trustworthiness without tipping into intensity. The first time Megan brought him to the house for dinner, he complimented my record collection. Said he'd grown up listening to Coltrane. I asked him which album. He said, "All of them, really." I noted that, filed it away. A man who actually grew up with Coltrane names an album. He doesn't say all of them, but I let it pass. The changes came gradually. That's how these things work. The first was the comments about the house. Small ones, delivered with a smile. "This kitchen layout is pretty retro, huh?" Or standing in the living room. "You know, with the right renovation, you could really open this space up." The word he used most was potential, as in the house had it, and I apparently wasn't using mine. Then came the finance talk at dinner. Investments, funds he was positioned well in, markets I'd never heard of. He'd glance at me when he said things like traditional thinking or people who aren't comfortable with modern instruments. Nothing direct. Just a current running under every conversation, and the current said, "The old man doesn't understand how the world works anymore." Around the 8-month mark, Megan stopped disagreeing with him. Not about big things, about anything. She'd look at me sometimes with an expression I didn't recognize at first, and then I did. Apology. She was apologizing in advance for something she hadn't done yet. "Don't bring up the investment stuff with Devin," she told me once when he'd stepped outside to take a call. "He gets frustrated when people are skeptical." I looked at her. I didn't say anything skeptical. "I know. Just, please, Dad." That was the moment I should have understood what was happening. Instead, I nodded and changed the subject, because I still believed this was a phase. I had a talent for appraising everything except the things happening in my own house. 18 months in, Devin stopped working at his firm, pursuing independent projects, Megan explained. The projects never seemed to produce income. Megan's salary as a marketing coordinator was covering their apartment, their dinners out, his golf club fees. The Sunday morning calls stopped around the same time. Then, on a Friday afternoon, Megan came to the house while I was in the workshop, routing cabinet edges, Monk on the record player, and told me that Devin would be moving in. Not could he, not what do you think, would be. She said his lease was ending, that it made sense, and she used the word temporary in a tone that suggested she was repeating something she'd been told to say. I set down the router. I looked at her. I thought about 17 things I could say, and I said none of them. "All right," I said. 2 days later, Devon Chancellor arrived with 3 suitcases, a garment bag, and a set of golf clubs. He leaned against my hallway wall without asking. His handshake at the door had changed, a little extra pressure in it, a small declaration. That night, around 11, I came downstairs for water. Devon was in the living room, phone to his ear, back to me. He didn't hear me on the stairs. The house is old, the acoustics particular, and I heard him clearly. "We'll handle the house situation by spring. The old man will cave on his own." I stood on the 3rd step from the bottom. Then I went to the kitchen, filled my glass, and carried it upstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. 27 years of appraising property, and I had just heard someone appraise me. He'd assigned me a value. In his calculation, I came up short. I thought, so that's what this is. I thought, all right, let's find out what you're actually worth. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't panic. It was the kind of wakefulness that comes from thinking clearly. I lay in the dark and ran numbers the way I always ran them before a difficult appraisal, methodically, without sentiment. The house, $512,000 at current market. Paid off. Title solely in my name. Savings, $94,300. Monthly consulting income, roughly $2,100. Devon Chancellor, no visible income for 4 months. Living in my guest room, golf clubs in my hallway, making plans in my living room at 11 at night. I got up at 5:30 and made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote down everything I knew and everything I'd observed. Dates, approximate quotes, behavioral patterns. Not accusation, documentation. Old habit. You don't walk into an appraisal with feelings. You walk in with a clipboard. And sitting there with that yellow pad, I let myself think honestly about how we'd gotten here. I remembered a Saturday about 2 years back, before Devon had made himself permanent. Megan had come over with groceries and made soup from scratch, chicken and fennel, something from a cookbook. And we'd sat at this same table for 3 hours. She'd talked about a difficult situation at work. I'd told her about a Victorian in the Irvington neighborhood I'd just appraised, owned by the same family for 80 years. We'd talked about what it meant to love a house. "I want that," she'd said, "something that stays." She was 29 and completely herself. I'd looked at her and thought, she's going to be fine. That woman felt very far away from the one who'd stood in my workshop 2 days ago, jaw set, apologizing with her posture. Somewhere in the intervening 2 years, someone had convinced her that staying was the same as stagnating. That her father's house was a symbol of limitation, not love. He'd done it carefully over time, the way you move a heavy object. Not by shoving, but by shifting the center of gravity by degrees, until it moves without you seeming to push. He was smarter than I'd initially credited. That bothered me less than it might have. Smart is workable. Smart leaves a paper trail. 6 days after Devon moved in, I drove to an office building on Southwest 5th Avenue and took the elevator to the 11th floor. Bridget Holland, Real Estate and Trust Law, found through avo.com. The reviews used words like precise, unsentimental, effective. Exactly what I needed. Her office was clean and minimal. She looked maybe 50, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead with the contained patience of someone who has heard every version of every family disaster and stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I told her the situation. No editorializing, just facts. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mr. Fletcher, do you understand what your property exposure looks like right now?" I said I had some idea. She walked me through it. Under Oregon law, a person living in a property for 30 days or more accrues certain tenant protections, regardless of whether a formal lease exists. Devon had been in the house 6 days. The clock was running. If Megan married him, the house, while titled solely to me, could become entangled in ways that were expensive and time-consuming to undo. Her recommendations were 2. First, a revocable living trust, transferring the property into it. Full control during my lifetime, Clean protection against outside claims. Cost, $2,800. Second, a written residential agreement with Devon, documenting his tenancy with formal conditions. Formalizing the relationship actually limits his legal standing, rather than expanding it. How soon can we do this? I asked. Trust documents in 48 hours. The rental agreement you can present to him this week. I signed the trust paperwork 2 days later. That evening I came home through the back of the house, through the garage, and stopped. The lock on the garage door was different. New brushed nickel handle, new deadbolt, new keypad. My key didn't fit. My workshop was behind that door. My tools, my records, the bench I'd built with my own hands. Devon was in the kitchen when I came around to the front. Hey! The old garage lock was practically falling off. I had a buddy who does locksmithing stopping by anyway, so I had him swap it out. I'll get you a key. He said it the way you'd mentioned changing a dead light bulb. Casual, helpful even. But I watched his face, and behind the helpfulness was something else. A small, satisfied look. The expression of a man who has just tested a boundary and is waiting to see whether it holds. I looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Sure, I said. Let me know when you have the key. I went upstairs, opened my yellow legal pad, and wrote, Garage lock replaced without permission or consent. Photograph tomorrow. Underneath that, I wrote, he does not understand what he is dealing with. I closed the pad. Downstairs, I could hear him laughing on his phone. I thought about the trust documents in my briefcase. I thought about Bridget Holland's precise voice saying 48 hours. I thought about the rental agreement sitting in a folder on my desk, waiting to be signed. And I thought about something I'd learned in 27 years of walking through other people's property. The most dangerous thing you can do when appraising an asset is underestimate what the owner is willing to do to protect it. He thought this was already over. He had no idea it hadn't begun. The next morning I went out to the garage before 6. The new lock stared at me from the door like a small act of occupation. I took out my phone, photographed it from 3 angles, and wrote the date in my yellow legal pad. Then I went inside and made coffee. What I noticed about myself in those days, I had stopped being surprised. Surprise is what you feel when things don't match your expectations. I had recalibrated my expectations. What I felt instead was something cooler and more useful. Attention. I was watching Devon Chancellor the way I used to watch a property before an appraisal, cataloging every crack, every soft spot, every place where the structure didn't hold. He had a natural ease around people that most manipulators would envy. At the breakfast table, he'd compliment something small, the coffee, the light through the window, and it was almost convincing. Almost. Because I'd started noticing the half-second before the compliment, the tiny calculation in his eyes, the way warmth arrived just slightly after the decision to deploy it, like a faucet, not a spring. He had 2 registers when talking about money. Around Megan, he spoke in futures, when we have, once we're positioned. Around me, he shifted to a performative humility I found particularly revealing. I know this isn't your approach, Raymond, and I respect that, said in a tone that respected nothing. He'd started calling me by my first name from day 3, without asking. Small territory, but territory. I kept the legal pad in my workshop, on the shelf above the bench. Every evening, a few lines, actions, words, approximate times. The kind of record that reads clearly under fluorescent courthouse lighting. About a week after Devon moved in, I contacted Terry Griffin, a name from the Portland Area Property Owners Association newsletter, a small ad at the bottom, background verification and financial due diligence. His office was on NE Broadway, Suite 3B, a second-floor walk-up with the particular quality of discretion you don't have to explain. Griffin was somewhere in his 50s, compact, with the stillness of someone who spends his professional life listening. Financial background, civil records, employment history, he said when I explained. Preliminary report in 10 days. Full report in 3 weeks. Fee is $1,500, half up front. Nothing illegal, I said. Just public record. That's all I do. He said it the way a plumber says I fix pipes. I gave him $750, and the name Devon Chancellor. That same week, I drafted the residential agreement. I'd read through Oregon's Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, ORS Chapter 90, and written a straightforward 2-page document. Monthly rent of $850, conditions of occupancy, explicit prohibition against modifications to the property without written consent, notarized and brought home. Megan's reaction was immediate. I watched her face move through confusion, indignation, something that looked almost like shame, and then the expression she'd been wearing most often lately, the one that meant she was about to say something Devin had coached her to say. "This is humiliating. You're treating him like a stranger." "I'm treating the situation like a legal one," I said, "which it is." Devin came to the kitchen 10 minutes later. He read the document, actually read it, set it down, and smiled. "This seems excessive, but if it makes you more comfortable, Raymond, I have no problem signing." The smile said, "This piece of paper means nothing." He signed, slid it back, went upstairs. I had it notarized the following morning. Original in my briefcase, copy in the workshop. He thought he was humoring me. He had no idea he'd just handed me the foundation of every legal action that would follow. 10 days later, Griffin's preliminary report arrived. I took it to the workshop, put on Kinda Blue, and opened it. 8 pages. Employment history, credit summary, civil court records. In the fall of 2021, Devin Chancellor had been named as a co-defendant in a civil lawsuit filed in King County, Washington. Fraudulent misrepresentation in connection with a private equity fund. Settled out of court. Settlement amount, $34,000. Paid without admission of liability. No admission of liability. That's how these things end when someone has enough money to make them go away and enough to lose if they don't. I thought about Megan's savings she'd mentioned dipping into. I thought about 4 months of independent projects with no visible income. I put the report on the shelf, picked up a chisel, not to use, just to hold, and stood there for a while. Then Megan appeared at the workshop door. She had the braced expression of someone delivering news they've been putting off. "Devin and I want to do an engagement dinner. Tasty N Daughters on NE 45th. Private room, 20 people. We thought you could handle the arrangements." Pause. "The deposit is $2,400. It's tradition for the father of the bride." I set the chisel down. "All right, I'll take care of it." She blinked. She'd expected resistance. "Really?" "Really, just send me the details." She left. I stood in the workshop and thought about the 8-page report on the shelf, and about a room full of 20 people in 3 weeks. They wanted me to pay for the party. That was fine. I had preparations to make, and a room full of witnesses was going to be exactly what I needed. I paid the deposit on a Tuesday morning, $2,400 to Tasty N Daughters, private dining room, 3 weeks out. The woman at the restaurant confirmed the reservation in a warm, professional voice and asked if there were any dietary restrictions among the guests. "None that I know of," I said, and then I drove to the Wells Fargo branch on Southwest 6th Avenue for a different kind of meeting, not with a banker. I sat in my car in the parking structure for about 20 minutes, thinking about something Bridget Holland had said during our second meeting, the week before. "Mr. Fletcher, there's something in the property records I think you should see." She'd shown me a document pulled from the county assessor's database. Devin Chancellor, using the address 2847 S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard, had submitted a mortgage refinancing application to a regional lender. The application listed the property as a personal asset, not a rental, not a family member's residence, a personal asset, implying ownership. The house I'd paid off 17 years ago. The house I'd transferred into a revocable living trust. The house where Devin Chancellor had lived, as a documented tenant, for less than 3 weeks at the time of submission. I sat in that parking structure for a while. I'm not an angry man by nature. Anger is loud and imprecise, and I've never found much use for it. But there's a particular feeling that arrives when someone miscalculates you so thoroughly that it becomes almost clarifying. When you understand, with complete certainty, both what they are and exactly what needs to happen next. I drove to Bridget's office that afternoon. She was at her desk when I arrived, reading glasses on, a document open in front of her. She looked up, registered my expression, and said, "You've thought about it." "What are the grounds?" I asked. She walked me through it methodically. Submitting false information on a mortgage application is a federal offense under 18 U.S.C. Section 1014. But that's criminal territory, and she wasn't a criminal attorney. In civil court, the same conduct could support a fraud claim. More immediately, the application constituted willful misrepresentation of property ownership, which gave me standing to file a complaint with the lender, with the Oregon Division of Financial Regulation, and in Multnomah County Circuit Court. How long to prepare the filing? I asked. I can have the complaint ready before the engagement dinner, she said, if that's the timeline you have in mind. I told her it was. She also raised one more matter. Based on the signed rental agreement and Devon's non-payment of the first month's rent, I had grounds for a formal eviction notice under ORS, Chapter 90.394, 30 days written notice, delivered in person or by certified mail. 2 documents, she said, the civil complaint and the eviction notice, both prepared, both filed or delivered on your schedule. I nodded. Let's do that. I left her office with a folder of intake forms and drove home thinking about a particular quality of patience. Not the passive kind, the waiting and hoping kind, but the active kind. The kind that looks like stillness from the outside and feels like precision from the inside. The following week, Griffin's full report arrived, 31 pages. I read it in the workshop over 2 evenings, with the door closed. The Seattle civil case was detailed now. Names, docket number, the nature of the alleged misrepresentation. Griffin had also pulled Devon's credit summary through a legitimate business inquiry channel. Outstanding balance of $18,700 on a Bank of America card, several accounts past due, and, this was the part that made me stop and read twice, an active child support enforcement action in Washington State. Monthly obligation of $640, arrears of $7,680. I thought about that number for a while. A man who owed $7,680 in child support arrears had moved into my house and was planning to refinance it. I called Bridget the next morning. I asked her whether the child support situation was relevant to anything we were doing. Not directly, she said, but if it ever comes to a hearing, it establishes a pattern. A man with a history of financial obligations he doesn't meet. Noted, I said. What I didn't tell her, what I was still working through myself, was a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since I'd read the report. A man doesn't accumulate $18,700 in credit card debt and $7,680 in child support arrears, while simultaneously presenting himself as a successful financial consultant, without having a plan for how those numbers get resolved. And when I looked at the pieces together, the refinancing application, the conversations I'd overheard about handling the house situation, the way he'd signed the rental agreement with the smile of a man who considers paperwork decorative, I began to see the outline of what that plan was. He needed the house, not in some vague eventual sense. He needed access to $512,000 in equity to resolve a financial position that was considerably worse than he'd let Megan see. I sat with that for a long time. Then I went to the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and brought it back to the workshop. I put on a Thelonious Monk record. I opened the legal pad to a fresh page and wrote, at the top, what I have. What he doesn't know, I have. 2 columns. I spent about an hour filling them in. By the time the coffee was gone, the engagement dinner was 6 days away, and I understood, with the same clarity I used to feel at the end of a long appraisal, when all the numbers finally resolved into a single defensible figure, exactly what I was going to do. The only thing left was the timing, and the timing, I had decided, was going to be his. The 3 days between paying the restaurant deposit and the engagement dinner were the quietest I'd had since Devon moved in. Something in me had settled. When you've made a decision and taken the steps to back it up, there's a particular stillness that follows. Not peace, exactly. More like the silence before a door opens. The morning after paying the deposit, I drove to Bridget Holland's office. The civil complaint, fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership in a mortgage refinancing application, was 8 pages, precise and clean. The formal eviction notice under ORS, Chapter 90.394 was 2 pages. 30 days to vacate, citing non-payment of rent under the signed rental agreement. You could file today, Bridget said, or wait for a moment where it has the most effect. 3 days, I said. She looked at me over her reading glasses. The dinner. He operates in rooms, I said. I want him to understand what this is in a room. She sealed both documents in a plain white envelope. Personal delivery by the property owner is sufficient for notice of an already filed action, especially with witnesses. There'll be 20, I said. I drove home. Devin was at the kitchen table when I came in. Looking forward to Saturday, he said, the tone of a man generously allowing you to attend your own party. It should be a good evening, I said. I made soup and listened to him describe the guest list. Colleagues, Megan's friends, his 2 brothers driving up from Eugene. He mentioned the private room at Tasty and Daughters with the proprietary pride of a man who chose the venue and arranged for someone else to fund it. The night before, I pressed my blue sweater, laid out my dark trousers, and checked the envelope in the briefcase. Then I sat in the workshop for an hour with a record on, not working on anything. When you've done the preparation, there's nothing left to do but wait. And if you've prepared correctly, the waiting is almost pleasant. The next evening I drove to NE 45th and parked a block from the restaurant. Cool, clear October night. I checked the briefcase. Envelope there. I went in. The private room at Tasty and Daughters held 20 people comfortably. Long table, warm lighting, the noise of a party already underway. I recognized some of Megan's friends. The rest were strangers. Devin's 2 brothers were near the window, broad-shouldered, careful dressers, his look on other frames. Megan was at the far end in a deep green dress. She came to me when I walked in and hugged me, and for a moment she was just my daughter again, and I held that for exactly as long as I allowed myself to. Dad, you look nice. You look beautiful, I said, because she did. I found my seat at the end of the table, the position of a man who has been placed somewhere convenient and is expected to stay there. I ordered water with lemon. I watched. Devin worked the room the way he always worked rooms, efficiently, warmly, leaving each person feeling noticed. He was very good at it. I'd watched him do it for 3 years, and I still found it technically impressive, the way you can admire a well-constructed lie. The room bent toward him naturally. Around 9, he picked up his glass and stood. The room quieted. Friends, he said, his voice warm and pitched for the whole table, I want to raise a toast to the woman who changed my life, my future wife, Megan. She's everything I could have asked for. Applause, genuine and easy. He paused, and I watched his eyes find me at the end of the table. The smile arrived. That specific one. The one I'd catalogued over 3 years. And of course, he said, to her insignificant old father, who won't be around much longer. Laughter. 20 people, and it moved through them like a current, because that's what happens when the most magnetic person in the room makes a joke. The room laughs before it decides whether the joke was funny. I set my glass down on the table. I stood up. The private room at Tasty and Daughters held 20 people comfortably. Long table, good lighting, the warm noise of a party already underway when I arrived. Megan's friends I recognized, several people I didn't. Devin's 2 brothers were near the window. I'd seen photos, but never met them in person. They had his look. Broad-shouldered, careful dressers, the kind of men who'd grown up knowing their appearance was an argument. Megan was at the far end of the table, in a deep green dress, luminous in the way she could be when she was happy. She came to me when I walked in and hugged me, and for a moment she was just my daughter again, before all of this, and I held on to that for exactly as long as I allowed myself to. Dad, you look nice. You look beautiful, I said, because she did. I found my seat, end of the table, the position of a man who has been placed somewhere convenient and is expected to stay there. I ordered water with lemon. I watched. Devin worked the room the way he always worked rooms, efficiently, warmly, leaving each person feeling noticed. He was very good at it. I'd watched him do it for 3 years, and I still found it technically impressive, the way you can admire a well-constructed lie. He moved from group to group, glass in hand, and the room bent toward him naturally. Around 9, he picked up his glass and stood. The room quieted. They recognized the gesture, the shift into ceremony. "Friends," he said, "I want to raise a toast." His voice was warm and full, pitched for the room. "To the woman who changed my life, my future wife, Megan. She's everything I could have asked for." Applause, genuine and easy. He paused, and I watched his eyes move to me at the end of the table. And there it was, the smile, the specific one, the one I'd catalogued. "And of course," he said, "to her insignificant old father, who won't be around much longer." Laughter. 20 people, and it moved through them like a current, because that's what happens when the most magnetic person in the room makes a joke. The room laughs before it decides whether the joke was funny. I set my glass down on the table. I stood up. 20 pairs of eyes moved to me. I want to describe the room clearly because it matters. 20 people, some who knew me, most who didn't. The laughter was still dissolving when I stood, still fading from a few faces around the table, and then something in my expression stopped it the rest of the way. Not anger. I wasn't angry. I'm not sure there's a word for what I was, exactly. Resolved, perhaps. The word that comes to mind is finished, in the sense of completed, like a piece of work you've put away because there's nothing left to add. I looked at Devon Chancellor across the length of the table. He was still holding his glass, still smiling, but the smile had gone slightly uncertain, the way a signal goes when something interferes with the transmission. He hadn't expected me to stand. In his version of this evening, I was a prop in the background, the convenient funding source who sat quietly at the end of the table while he performed. Standing up wasn't in the script he'd written. I looked at him for 3 seconds. I counted them privately. Then I said 5 words, quietly, clearly, without inflection of any kind. I already filed the paperwork. The room didn't understand. I watched it in real time. The confusion moving across the faces of Megan's friends, the polite, uncertain expressions of people waiting to find out if this was part of a toast, a joke, something that would resolve itself in a moment into something comfortable. Devon's brothers exchanged a glance, but Devon understood. I watched it happen in his face, and I will describe it accurately, because it was one of the most precisely satisfying things I have ever witnessed in my life. First, stillness. The smile stopped moving. His face went to a kind of neutral that wasn't calm. It was the neutral of a man whose systems had just received information that required emergency processing. His eyes went sharp in a way that had nothing to do with the warmth he'd been performing all evening. For just a moment, I saw what was actually behind the careful presentation, calculation, and beneath the calculation something that looked very much like fear. Then his jaw shifted, slightly forward, slightly tight, a man trying to recover composure by taking up physical space. His free hand, the one not holding the glass, found the back of the nearest chair, and his fingers closed around it, not dramatically, quietly, like a man steadying himself so that no one would notice he needed steadying. His knees didn't buckle in a theatrical way. It was subtler, and because of that, more revealing. A slight give in his posture, a fractional drop in his center of gravity, as if the weight of what he'd just understood had become briefly physical. He gripped the chair back harder. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed the white envelope. I walked the length of the table, no hurry, no performance, and set it in front of him. The room was very quiet now. 20 people watching a man they'd been laughing with 30 seconds ago hold on to a chair with white knuckles. "That's from my attorney," I said. "The civil complaint has already been filed with Multnomah County Circuit Court. Fraudulent misrepresentation of property ownership in a mortgage refinancing application. You listed my house as your asset. It isn't." I let that sit for a moment. "There's also a formal eviction notice in there, under the rental agreement you signed. 30 days to vacate." Devon's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. His brothers were very still. Megan was staring at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not the coached indignation I'd grown used to. Something more like the look a person gets when a room they thought they knew turns out to have a wall where they expected a door. "Enjoy your evening," I said. I picked up my jacket from the back of my chair. "The dinner's paid for. Might as well eat." I left the room. I didn't look back. Outside, the air was cold and clear and October quiet. I stood on NE 45th for a moment, breathing it in. Then I walked to my car, sat down, and allowed myself one thing. I laughed. Short, quiet, to no one. Because I had spent 27 years appraising things, and I had just seen a man's actual worth, revealed to a room full of people who'd believed his estimate of himself, and it had turned out, as these things often do, to be significantly inflated. I drove home. I put the car in the garage, my garage with my lock, which I'd had rekeyed the same week I visited Bridget Holland's office. I went to the workshop and put on a record and sat at the bench for a while, not doing anything in particular. Around 11, my phone rang. Megan. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I answered. She was crying. Not the composed, performative crying I'd watched her use in arguments over the past months. Real crying. The kind that makes it hard to form sentences. Dad. What? What did you just do? I served notice of a legal action, I said, and a formal eviction notice. In front of everyone. Her voice cracked on the last word. Yes. You humiliated him. I thought about that for a moment. About a man with a raised glass and a smile, and the words insignificant, old father, in a room of 20 people. He set the terms for the evening, I said. I just responded to them. There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing. He says you fabricated the whole thing. The paperwork, he says it's a manipulation. The filing number's in the envelope, I said. Multnomah County Circuit Court. Case number is on the first page. It's public record. You can look it up tomorrow morning. Another pause. Longer. He says you won't win. He's welcome to that opinion, I said. Good night, Megan. I set the phone down on the workbench. The record was still playing. Something slow and considered. The kind of music that doesn't ask anything of you. I sat with it for a while. She hadn't apologized. She'd called. She'd cried. But she hadn't said, I'm sorry. And she hadn't said, you were right. She was still standing where Devin had positioned her, looking through the frame he'd built. That was all right. Frames can be rebuilt. But it takes time, and it usually takes evidence. I had more evidence coming. The morning after the engagement dinner, I slept until 7, which for me is sleeping in. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the house. My house. The one with the original hardwood floors that creaked on the third step. The one I'd paid off 17 years ago, transferred into a revocable living trust, and spent the last month defending with the same methodical attention I'd given to every property I'd ever appraised. Devin was not in the house. He and Megan had gone, I presume to her apartment, or wherever they'd been spending time when not using my kitchen. The guest room was empty. The golf clubs were still in my hallway. I moved them to the porch that morning. Small thing, but mine. By afternoon, Bridget Holland called. Devin Chancellor has retained an attorney, she said. She said it the way she said most things, without inflection, as a fact requiring a response rather than a feeling. They filed a motion contesting the validity of the rental agreement. The argument is that your client signed under duress. I thought about Devin in my kitchen, reading that document with his careful legal eyes, then sliding it back with a smile. Under duress. He'd signed that agreement with the smile of a man who believed paperwork was decorative. That'll be interesting to argue, I said. It won't hold, Bridget said. The notary documented the signing. There's no evidence of any pressure, but it'll slow things down slightly. That may be the point. What else? A pause. There's been a complaint filed with Adult Protective Services, anonymous, alleging erratic and concerning behavior on your part. I sat with that for a moment. I'm 64 and I live alone in a house I own, and I had just served legal notice on a man who'd been planning to use that house as collateral for his own financial rescue. An anonymous complaint about erratic behavior was, under the circumstances, a fairly predictable move. They'll want to do a welfare check, Bridget said, within the next few weeks. All right, I said. Let them. Raymond, do you understand what I'm saying? This is an attempt to... I know what it is, I said. I'll be ready. I hung up and sat in the kitchen for a while. Then I went to the workshop and reorganized the shelf above my bench. The yellow legal pad, the 2 file folders, the photos of the garage lock, the printed copies of the bank application, everything in order, everything documented, dated, and clear. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, Mr. Fletcher? A woman's voice, careful, slightly apologetic. My name is Cynthia Watkins. I work at the same financial services firm where Devon Chancellor used to consult. She paused. I heard about what happened at the engagement dinner. A friend of mine was there. I kept my voice level. What can I do for you, Ms. Watkins? I'm not sure this is my place, she said, but I think you should know something. In August, before the engagement, Devon was actively soliciting investors for what he described as a real estate development opportunity in Portland. He presented it to 3 or 4 people at our firm. He used an address on S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard as the asset anchor, described it as property he controlled. She paused again. That address is yours, isn't it? I looked at the kitchen wall. August. 2 months before he'd moved in. 2 months before the engagement party. He'd been running this plan before the ring was even on Megan's finger. It is, I said. I just thought you should know. I don't want to be involved in anything legal. I want to be clear about that. But it seemed like information you deserve to have. Ms. Watkins, I said, I want to be transparent with you. I'd like to record this conversation if you consent, just for my own records. Nothing that would go public without your permission. There was a brief pause. Yes, that's fine. I put the call on speaker and started recording on my phone. She repeated the core of what she'd told me with details, the approximate dates, the names of colleagues she'd been present with when Devon made his pitch, the way he'd presented the Hawthorne address, not as a future property, but as a current asset. After she hung up, I saved the recording with a timestamp. Then I sent a text to Bridget. Call me when you can. I have something new. She called within the hour. When I described what Cynthia Watkins had told me, there was a brief silence on her end. He was representing your property as a controlled asset to potential investors, before he had any legal claim to it whatsoever, she said, 2 months before he moved in. That substantially strengthens the civil case. It establishes intent and a pre-existing pattern. Another pause. Can she put any of this in writing? Even a simple statement? I'll ask. I think she might. I sat in the workshop after the call, not doing anything in particular. There was a clock on the wall above the door. Old thing, wooden case, kept good time. I watched it for a while. A welfare check had been requested. Devon was fighting the eviction. He'd recruited Megan, or she'd volunteered. I genuinely wasn't certain which, and I found that uncertainty more painful than most of the other things that had happened in the past month. But Cynthia Watkins had called me. That I hadn't planned for, and I'd learned, over a long career of walking into properties that were not what they appeared to be, that the information you didn't plan for was often more valuable than the information you did. The welfare check was coming. Let it come. I was ready. The welfare check was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. The inspector was a young woman named Doreen. She arrived at 10, clipboard in hand, with the politely neutral expression of someone doing a job they take seriously without dramatizing it. She introduced herself, showed her ID, and I invited her in. The house was clean. The kitchen was in order. I'd made a pot of coffee. She walked through the main floor first. Living room, kitchen, the downstairs bathroom. Asked a few standard questions. How was I sleeping? Was I eating regularly? Did I have any health concerns I'd like to discuss? I answered all of them directly. No, I had no health concerns. Yes, I was sleeping fine. The coffee was Colombian if she wanted a cup. She accepted the coffee. Then I said, I'd like to show you something before you complete your report, if that's all right. I brought out the folder I'd prepared and set it on the kitchen table. Doreen looked at it. This is the signed rental agreement, I said, opening the folder, with the date of signing and the notary's witness stamp. This is the preliminary background report I commissioned from a licensed private investigator. It documents an outstanding credit card balance of $18,700 and an active child support enforcement action in Washington State, with arrears of $7,680. This, I placed the bank document in front of her, is a printout of a mortgage refinancing application submitted to a regional lender using this property's address as a personal asset at a time when the applicant had no ownership interest in it whatsoever. And this is a time-stamped recording of a conversation I had with a colleague of the applicant, taken with her full knowledge and consent, in which she describes him presenting this address as a controlled asset to potential investors as early as August of this year. Doreen set down her coffee cup. She picked up the bank document and read it. Then she looked at the recording note. Then she read the first page of the background report. The kitchen was quiet, except for the old house sounds. The radiator, the faint creak from the upstairs hallway. "Mr. Fletcher," she said finally, setting the documents down, "the complaint we received appears to have been submitted by a party with a significant conflict of interest." "That would be my assessment as well," I said. She wrote something on her clipboard, collected her things, and thanked me for the coffee. "I'll be recommending the complaint be closed," she said at the door. "No further action required." I thanked her, and I meant it. That afternoon, Bridget called with the court's ruling on Devon's motion contesting the rental agreement. The motion had been denied. The court found no evidence of duress. The original agreement stood, which meant the eviction notice stood, which meant Devon Chancellor was required to pay 2 months of outstanding rent, $1,700, or vacate the property at 2847 S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard by the 20th of the month. I recorded the ruling in the yellow legal pad and set it on the shelf. That evening, Megan sent me a text message. Not a phone call, a text, which felt like its own kind of statement about the distance she was maintaining. "Dad, the court thing is wrong. Devon says you fabricated the whole situation to get him out of the house. He says the APS check will prove you're not well." I read it twice. The APS check had already been closed. She didn't know that yet. I typed back. "The case number for the Multnomah County filing is public record. The APS case was closed this morning with no action. I'm fine, Megan. I hope you are too." She didn't respond. I put the phone on the workbench and picked up the piece of oak I'd been shaping for the past 2 weeks. A cabinet front, precise dimensions, waiting for its final pass with the hand plane. I worked on it for about an hour in the quiet of the workshop. The familiar weight of the tool, the particular sound the blade made against the grain. These things don't change regardless of what else is happening. That's what I've always valued about working with wood. It doesn't negotiate. It either fits or it doesn't. The message from Megan sat in my phone like a question I didn't yet know how to answer. Not because I didn't know what to say. I knew exactly what the facts were and where they led. But because she was my daughter, and somewhere inside all the coached certainty she'd been operating from for the past 2 years, there was still the woman who'd sat at my kitchen table and told me she wanted something that stayed. She'd find her way back to that. Or she wouldn't. But I'd stopped believing that I could make that happen with words. The filing was in progress. The eviction notice was running its clock. Devon Chancellor had so far paid $0 of the $1,700 he owed. And somewhere, in a city that had no idea any of this was happening, a man who had listed my house as his asset was running out of moves. I set the hand plane down, ran my thumb along the edge of the oak, smooth and exact, no catches. I turned off the workshop light and went inside. I had more patience than he had options. At this point, that was enough. The 20th of the month arrived the way deadlines always do, without warning you because the date was always right there on the calendar, and the only surprise is your own faint hope that something might change before it got there. Nothing changed. Devon hadn't paid the $1,700. He hadn't contacted Bridget's office, hadn't responded to the eviction notice, hadn't communicated anything except the kind of silence that says, "I'm going to make this as difficult as I possibly can." At 9 in the morning, a county-appointed process server knocked on my door. I let him in, showed him the guest room, signed the relevant paperwork, and made myself a second cup of coffee. The process took about 40 minutes. When it was over, I stood in the guest room doorway and looked at the space. Bare mattress, curtains I'd had for 20 years, the small window that caught the afternoon light in autumn. Clean, quiet. Devon came with Megan. I hadn't expected that. I thought he might leave Megan out of it, at minimum spare her the mechanics. But he didn't. They arrived at 9:30 with 2 large duffel bags and the garment bag, and I sat in the kitchen with my coffee and let the process server handle the interaction. I heard voices in the hallway. Devon's, lower, controlled. The process server's, flat and professional. At some point, from the kitchen, I heard the golf clubs being picked up off the porch. Then I heard Devon's voice closer to the kitchen doorway. Your father chose this house over you, Megan. Remember that. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The man had $18,700 in credit card debt, $7,680 in child support arrears, a civil court judgment already on file, and was currently being escorted out of a property he'd tried to list as a personal asset while planning how to remove its owner. The house had not been chosen over anyone. The house was simply still standing, the way it had always been standing, the way it would continue to stand. I heard the front door close. I sat in the kitchen for a few minutes. Then I went to the workshop, opened the garage, my lock, and turned on the light. I put on a record, something unhurried. I picked up the cabinet front I'd been working on and ran my hand along the edge, smooth, ready for its final fitting. I worked for about 2 hours. About 3 weeks after that, my phone rang from a number I recognized as belonging to someone I'd never met. A mutual connection, as it turned out, of one of Megan's acquaintances, a man named Stewart. He introduced himself as a former colleague of Megan's and explained that he'd recently been approached by Devon Chancellor about a real estate investment opportunity. He'd been shown a presentation. The anchor asset was a property on S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, described in Devon's words as a family asset positioned for development. Stewart had done some research before investing. He'd found the Multnomah County filing. He was calling to ask if I could confirm what he'd found. I confirmed it. Then I emailed him Terry Griffin's full background report, with Terry's permission. I'll be passing on the opportunity, Stewart said. That's a sound decision, I said. 2 days later, Devon sent me a text message. 4 words, you will regret this. I photographed it, forwarded it to Bridget, and filed a copy with the non-emergency line at the Portland Police Bureau. Bridget added it to the file. This is how these things are handled. Not with emotion, but with documentation. Then about 10 days before the shortest month of the year ended, my phone rang late in the evening. Megan, I almost didn't answer. Not because I didn't want to speak to her, because I didn't know anymore what version of her would be on the line. The coached version, the grieving version, the one still positioned between 2 different stories about who her father was. I answered. She was crying. Real crying. The kind that makes sentences hard to form. And then she said something I hadn't planned for. Something that sat in the air of my kitchen long after the call ended. Dad. I found messages on his phone. From a woman. They go back to August. August. The same August he'd been pitching my property to investors. The same August he'd presumably been shopping for an engagement ring while corresponding with someone else. I sat with that for a moment. How many? I asked. A lot, her voice cracked. A lot, Dad. I didn't say I told you so. That's not a sentence. That's a surrender of everything you're actually trying to say. Do you want to come home? I asked. There was a long pause. Then, not tonight. I just needed to tell someone. All right, I said. Call me when you're ready. She hung up. I put the phone on the workbench and sat in the kitchen without turning on any lights for a while. Outside, the street was wet and lit orange from the lamps, and my house was very quiet, and it belonged to me, and it was going to keep belonging to me. She came home 11 days later. No call ahead, no text. I heard a car in the driveway around 7 in the evening, and when I opened the front door, Megan was standing on the porch with one suitcase, and the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time, and has finally decided to set it down. Your room's the same, I said. Keys on the hook. She nodded. She came inside. I made tea, and she sat at the kitchen table, and we didn't talk much that evening, which was fine. Some things don't require words immediately. They require a room that's been waiting. The engagement was formally broken off in the first week of January. Not in a conversation I witnessed. Megan handled it, and she didn't ask me to be involved, and I respected that. What she told me, simply, was that it was done. Devon did not take it quietly. Within 2 weeks, a civil claim landed in Bridget's mailbox, filed through his attorney, alleging emotional distress and what the complaint called deliberate and malicious interference in a personal relationship. Bridget called me to describe it in the same tone she used for everything. His grounds? I asked. He argues that your filing of the civil complaint and the eviction proceedings constituted harassment designed to end the engagement. I thought about that. Does it hold? It will be dismissed at the preliminary hearing, she said. There's no legal basis for a claim that protecting your property from fraudulent misuse constitutes harassment. We'll file a response. The preliminary hearing was 3 weeks later. I didn't attend. Bridget represented the response. She called me that afternoon. Dismissed, she said. The judge found no actionable claim. He also noted on the record that the original civil complaint regarding the mortgage application appeared well-founded and was proceeding appropriately. I wrote that down in the yellow legal pad. Last entry. The civil case regarding the mortgage application resolved in the following weeks. The court found that Devon Chancellor had submitted materially false information in a financial application by representing a property he had no ownership interest in as a personal asset. The penalty, a fine of $4,200, mandatory correction of all financial filings that had referenced the property, and formal notification to the lender. The bank, on its own initiative, based on the court documentation, annulled the refinancing application and flagged his profile. Bridget sent me the final order by email. I read it at the kitchen table, then filed it in the folder on the shelf in the workshop, next to the legal pad, next to the first report from Terry Griffin, next to the photos of the replaced garage lock that had started all of this. A $512,000 house, still mine, a revocable living trust, registered and clean, a savings account, $94,300 minus the trust setup at $2,800, the investigator at $1,500, and the engagement dinner deposit at $2,400. Total expenses, $6,700. Balance, $87,600. Devon Chancellor had walked into my house with 3 suitcases, a garment bag, and a plan. He'd walked out with the same 3 suitcases, the garment bag, a court-ordered fine, a flag on his credit file, and a text message on record with the police bureau that he probably wished he hadn't sent. On a morning in mid-February, the kind of cold, clear Portland morning where you can see your breath inside the garage if you haven't turned the heat on yet, Megan came downstairs while I was making breakfast. She sat at the kitchen table. I made eggs and toast and poured 2 cups of coffee and we ate. After a while she said, "You could have just told me what he was." I thought about that. I'd thought about it many times over the past 5 months. "I could have," I said, "but you didn't." "No." She looked at me across the table. "Why?" I put my fork down. "Because you would have heard a father trying to protect his house. And you wouldn't have been wrong. I was protecting my house. But that wasn't the only thing that was true." I picked up my coffee. "You needed to see what he was through something that couldn't be argued with. Documents can't be accused of being jealous." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's very calculated." "I'm an appraiser," I said. "It's what I do." She almost smiled. First time in a long time. We finished breakfast. I washed the dishes. She went back upstairs to start her day, and I went to the workshop and turned on the light, and put on a record, and picked up the cabinet front that had been waiting on the bench for the better part of 2 months. The house on S.E. Hawthorne Boulevard stood exactly as it had always stood. Hardwood floors, creaking third step, the window that sticks in August. 41 years of careful ownership and 1 revocable living. Trust registered in Multnomah County. Mine. 5 words, that's all it took. 5 quiet words in a room full of people, and a man who had spent months planning to take someone's home, someone's dignity, someone's place in his own daughter's life, grabbed the back of a chair and couldn't let go. But here's what those 5 words actually were. The last line of a plan that started weeks earlier, in a lawyer's office, with a document nobody thought mattered. That's the story of Raymond Fletcher, a 64-year-old man who didn't raise his voice once, who didn't threaten, didn't plead, didn't try to win an argument. He opened a legal pad, picked up a pen, and started writing dates. If you're watching this, there's a good chance you know someone, or you are someone, who has been quietly written off, treated like a problem to be managed, a signature to be obtained, a name on a deed that someone else has already spent. And if that's the case, here is the most practical thing this story has to offer. Act before you think you have to. A written residential agreement costs almost nothing to prepare and can take 30 days of informal occupancy and turn it into something with clear terms and limits. A revocable living trust, which keeps you in full control of your property while you're alive and protects it afterward, typically runs between $1,500 and $3,000 to set up. A consultation with a real estate attorney in most cities is $200 to $500. Raymond spent $6,700 total. He protected a $512,000 asset, documented a fraud, and closed an eviction, all inside 90 days. He didn't do it because he was clever. He did it because he moved first. That option is available to you, too. If you're in a situation right now that looks anything like Raymond's, if someone in your home is making decisions about your property as if your name on the title is a formality, you're not overreacting by taking it seriously. The people who told Raymond he was making it awkward were laughing at the engagement dinner. They weren't laughing at the end. You built what you built. You have every right to protect it. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes one story at the right moment is the thing that helps a person decide to make the call and leave a comment. Tell us, was there a moment in your life when someone underestimated you and paid for it? We read every one. Thank you for being here.